Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How Much Farther to the Promised Land? Purchase Decisions and the Evolving Landscape of GPS, Multi-GNSS, and Alternative PNT. Brought to you by GPS World and our sponsor, NavCom. I'm Bethany Chambers from North Coast Media, publisher of GPS World Magazine, and I will be your event manager. Before we get started, I want to let you know that today's webinar will be recorded. You are currently in a listen-only mode. The recording will be available 2 weeks from today on our website at gpsworld.com/webinars. A link to the on-demand recording will also be emailed to you when it is available. At this time, I'd like to acquaint you with the ways in which you can participate during today's presentation. Please notice in the lower left-hand corner of your console that there is a Submit button. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Just type in the text box at the bottom left, then click Submit to place your question in queue. Questions that were submitted during registration may be covered in this webinar. Some questions may also be answered in an upcoming issue of GPS World Magazine or in one of our e-newsletters. We strive to answer as many of your questions as possible. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties during today's event, select Help to submit your issue, and Assistant Producer Joelle Harms or I will personally assist you. Now I'd like to turn today's event over to our moderator, GPS World publisher Alan Cameron.
Thank you, Bethany, and welcome everyone to this GPS World webinar sponsored by NavCom. How much farther to the promised land? Purchase decisions in the evolving landscape of GPS, multi-GNSS, and alternative PNT. One of our listeners has already written in with a question, is there really a promised land in the future? And I'm going to take that bull right by the horns and answer it right here to start off our program. Existentially, in an existential sense, I cannot answer that question. But Tom Nolan, in the world of GNSS, yes, there really is a promised land in the future. More to the point, in the broader world of PNT generally, positioning, navigation, and timing, using all technologies, not just space-based, satellite-generated technologies, there definitely is a promised land. And our speakers today are going to lay out a roadmap on how to get there and what it will look like when we do get there. The context for this webinar, or the genesis of it, came a bit out of last month's, or actually 2 months ago in April, the two GLONASS stumbles, signal failures, one systemic and one a little bit more narrowly defined. At any rate, a couple of industry leaders wrote to me immediately, and I published what they wrote to me, calls for multi-GNSS and for redundant PNT to cope with such situations, among others. However, neither multi-GNSS nor redundant PNT can really exist now, is really truly pervasively available to the user. It's all down the road a little bit. And in buying PNT equipment for various uses in various industries, there are decisions to be made as to how much capability to buy or even when to buy. Should users rely on whatever technology is currently available until the perfect system is here, or should users continuously upgrade each time some additional capability becomes available, even though it's not the final answer yet? We've got 4 speakers here today to answer that question from their various perspectives: high precision, mass market, signal simulation, and alternative PNT. Our first speaker is Steve Ault, who's been at NavCom Technology for nearly a decade now. He has previous experience at Magnavox and Leica, and he currently oversees all of NavCom's marketing activities. Steve, why don't you give us your presentation? Take it away.
Thank you, Alan. Good day, and thank you for taking this time to investigate the PNT horizon with us. Answering the question, How much farther to the promised land depends on your need and perspective. So let's get a few fundamental questions out of the way to provide some clarity in determining a practical answer. As you can see from the graphics on this page, the timelines to fully declared operational systems and enhancements to existing systems extends out for a dozen years. Granted, the remaining positioning constellations are expected to be declared operational sometime in 2018. Does that mean that users will benefit from using those signals before the constellations are declared operational? The simple answer is yes, but with the understanding that there is no agency or manufacturer guarantee of performance until those constellations are declared operational. The augmentation picture has also changed dramatically in the past few years and grows even more complicated as we speak. Apart from the familiar RTCM and proprietary RTK formats, regional SBAS constellations and current generation global SBAS constellations, the increasing need for higher instantaneous geodetic accuracy has spawned multiple network and receiver approaches. All SBAS constellations operating today will continue to realize updates in support of the new signals, though likely at a lagging rate as compared to RTK, as the approach to utilizing the satellite correction data is highly reliant on our RTK techniques. Beyond the introduction of new signals, which largely benefit users most by improving satellite geometry and challenging environments, constellations which provide 3 frequencies per satellite are anticipated to significantly improve SBAS convergence time and final accuracy to meet near RTK performance. Given this, there is lots of talk in the market about the number of receiver channels needed. The table on the right side of this slide provides a realistic view of the best possible scenario. We also know from our experience with GPS and GLONASS that the receiver is going to track about 25 to 30% fewer satellites than the best case scenario of a given constellation at any given time due to orbital patterns and receiver geographic location. Based on this, a receiver with 120 channels appropriately split between the upper and lower bands should meet most basic user needs. This begs the question, why then do so many receivers have more channels? The additional channels are typically used to do background operations such as measure noise, operate a backup navigation engine, or other unique and supportive operations. This table provides some insight to several different markets to illustrate how their needs differ. For example, the land survey market is typically the first to adopt new positioning technologies and places a lot of emphasis on manufacturers to bring these to the market quickly. Even as the new technology is still being developed, by stark comparison, the MIL-Gov market segment is much slower to adopt and test new technologies in this space. Because their integrated project plans often extend over multiple years, it is not uncommon for commercial off-the-shelf products to reach their natural end of life before a MIL-Gov program goes into production. At the end of the day, each program decision maker needs to evaluate the tools that are readily available to them against the project needs to determine if those tools are suitable for the job. If not, then he needs to look at 2 things when considering new equipment. Is the technology that is available today better than what I already have? And is the technology I can buy today going to meet my longer-term needs through updates which may or may not happen within the current product lifecycle? Similarly, manufacturers will only support fielded products for so long. Feature updates for products which are near or at product end of life are highly unlikely, as manufacturers look to their newest products as their best opportunity to further technology and best opportunity for new revenue. To that end, manufacturers are also looking at what's next, even as they bring new products to the market today. Product life cycles are typically 3 to 5 years in this industry, and purchasers can expect that the buying decision is not based just around the supported constellations, but the ease of integration, additional new methods of interfacing with those products and services they support. Speaking of services, there are a plethora of means to improve the GNSS receiver's position. High precision has different meaning to different people. For our purpose, we'll consider high precision to mean geodetic accuracy better than 20 centimeters. Today, that rules out IALA or RTCM code and regional SBAS, as their typical performance is well above the 20 centimeter threshold. That leaves the old standby of RTK and commercial global SBAS. But the old standby of RTK isn't old at all. Like the constellations, RTK has taken on a new life of its own over the past 4 or 5 years and will continue to change as the new constellations are introduced. And these changes come at a high cost due to the many flavors of RTK and the desire of users to remain backward compatible. Services range from standalone single base, cores, network single base, network adjusted single base, VRS with 3 variants, MAC, and a new on the horizon MSM. To complicate RTK services further, there are public standards, proprietary standards, and non-interoperable telecommunications technologies at play. RTK has an extremely limited range when compared to any SBAS system, and RTK cannot easily be used offshore. These restrictions limit user product and service choices. However, commercial global SBAS services are gaining in functionality and ease of use, driving interest from the end user community. There are literally only a handful of service providers in this market, of which Navcom is one with its Starfire service. Global SBAS is not without its challenges. When I first started in this industry in 1990, getting RTK performance under 1 meter was a phenomenal breakthrough at a 10-kilometer baseline. It took multiples of years to get the sub-centimeter performance we expect today. The same is true for global SBAS. Only a couple of companies have found the magic recipe to achieve 5-centimeter real-time positioning at the expense of what we call convergence time. However, Navcom is a pioneer in this field and has been providing global SBAS services publicly for the past 15 years, with dramatic improvements realized in positioning accuracy, convergence time, and added features over that time frame. We expect this trend to continue with improving lost my space. Just a moment. With improving convergence times and positioning accuracy, particularly as third satellite frequencies and new constellations are introduced. It's self-evident that this viable technology is gaining traction when viewing business acquisitions taken by our competitors during the past couple of years, as this technology moves closer to RTK level performance. Pulling this all together now, ultimately, end users will need to evaluate their current needs against available technology, just as we all do when purchasing long-term assets. It behooves one to do some product and industry research before making a final purchasing decision. And in today's market, one should also consider the services which are needed to support the product, because the purchase of that product is not going to achieve the desired performance level without some form of augmentation and interoperability. At Navcom, we offer both high precision and high quality products, as well as global SBAS services, and we hope that you take the time to consider both of these at your next product review. We thank this audience for sharing in this presentation and GPS World for the opportunity to offer our perspective. Back to you, Alan.
All right, thank you, Steve, and thank you for the reminder about the many varieties of RTK that have blossomed over the last few years. I'm going to take that as a suggestion to have a webinar sometime in the future about these many varieties of RTK, because they are quite diverse, different advantages to each kind, and they show a rapid development in new technology for users. We'll return to that topic later. Before I introduce our next speaker, I want to let everyone in the audience know that the slides that you're seeing will be downloadable. You can get copies of the slides. We'll give you a link at the end of the webinar. You'll be able to get all these slides. Our next speaker is Philip Matos, who for many years, in fact, when I first came to know him, has been an R&D scientist for ST Microelectronics. He was the chief architect of their GPS and GNSS chipsets over the years. Much of much of, I don't know how much of, but much of STMicro's market is in cars, placing GNSS chips in car navigation devices. Steve, it's your show. Take it away.
I'm
sorry, Philip.
Is it all right
Philip.
if I speak? Okay. Yes, well, as Alan said, I've been with ST for a very long time. And yes, he's right. Currently, a large proportion is in cars. However, over the last 10 years, a huge percentage has been in the handheld sat-navs that people take to their cars and plug into the cigarette lighter. So both those types of cars. Consumer, but not a concentration on phones, is the right area. So I have a title slide because I want to concentrate on the title a little bit. Alan's already concentrated on the word promised land. I'd like to concentrate on the next line, the multi-GNSS, the redundant PNT, the reliable, the robust, consistent, continuous. The bottom line is largely just integrity. We are there at the front end of the food chain. Whichever company I'm working for, I'm generally working for the people who design the chips and put the chips on boards or antennas or software right at the front. So we don't have a purchaser as such. Of course, someone needs to buy our product, but there's a long food chain, and until that chain is completed to the end and they can see a route to sell the end product, they're not going to start at the front of the food chain. On the other hand, at the front of the food chain, we are already at that promised land to a large degree. You'll see when I get to that slide that the word almost appears, and it's in red because I accept it's a very important word. My background, I started with Cambridge University and British Telecom Research, which in those days was about the same but smaller than Bell Labs in the US, so very much a research organization. I moved to GPS in 1987. I've been a consultant on Galileo since 1997. And I've done receivers for LORAN, for GPS, for Galileo, for GLONASS, and finally last year for Beidou. I was with STM, in charge of their GNSS team technical charge. Luckily, I was able to escape being an administrative charge. Technical charge of the GNSS team until March this year. And then I became a freelance consultant working for more than one company. So multi-GNSS is already here. So as a previous speaker said, we might not have full operational capability declared on every signal, on every constellation. But as far as the chips are concerned, as far as being able to test them with real signals, we have a very large number of constellations. They're all here. But as I said about food chains, it's a very long path. From the ICD or the spec that tells us what the signal is going to be, through the satellites and the signal being transmitted so that we can play with it, then getting receiver chips made, and no one's going to make them if there isn't going to be a market in the very short future. But we've got that far. We're down there for everything except perhaps the dual frequency low band signals. Perhaps we don't have yet a real market for L2, L5 type signals. But otherwise, the chips for the upper L band are all there. So it's all purely a matter now of market push or pull for people to actually get those chips into systems so they get their way to the end user. And government influence, although we disapprove of government influence on the whole in the Western world, we think we should have a free market, but actually governments are amazingly important. So America deciding that America deciding that E911 was going to be compulsory many, many years ago had a huge effect in pushing GPS into phones. The eCall discussions in Europe have pushed Galileo into cars. The ERA GLONASS discussions in Russia forced GLONASS into a huge number of applications. And we can keep going with E911, we just mentioned, and E212, which will be the European equivalent. So we need something to get us over the hump. The chips are available, but the equipment with all this multi-GNSS is not quite in the hands of the consumer yet. So the spec for the discussion used the words redundant and robust. Well, we're almost there, hence almost in red. All we need is the time to percolate into the field. The market needs to identify what it wants. Does it want accuracy or does it want availability? It obviously wants both, but which one does it want to prioritize? We have a problem, I'm emphasizing the almost again here, we have a problem that they're all weak signals, and they don't serve buildings, they don't serve tunnels. We also have a problem that they're all adjacent frequencies, so it's very easy to jam them in one single operation. L2C and L5 will fix that problem by being on a very different frequency, but they still suffer from the weak signals not going into buildings too well problem. So there is a lot of almosting still. When we look at infrastructure, this is the hidden side of GNSS, where it's not used for something that's particularly moving. It's used for timing in a power station or in a cell phone base station, timing in telecoms installations. They've been very kind to us in that they've expected failures. So they already have built into their systems the ability to carry over for up to 24 hours of interruption. But they now require such an accurate system that they can't do that 24-hour holdover anymore. So they want multi-GNSS timing systems. The wireless telecom sites don't want to have all that equipment there. They want to directly get the redundant, as in more than one system. Same for power systems, same for financial systems. So what are the issues? The issues are not really GNSS malfunctions, because GNSS malfunctions, by that I mean the satellites and the control systems at that end rather than at the user end, that's completely manageable in any multi-GNSS receiver that's designed to do it. Many are not. Many are simply designed to give 100% availability. The most likely issue is jamming. And then in jamming, the most likely version is what I call intentional but not the direct target, the line in orange. By that, I mean somebody driving a van has a jammer in his van to jam himself because he doesn't want his boss to know that he stopped off at his girlfriend's for tea when he should have been working. But that jammer in his van passes the reference station for some big system, passes the GSM cell site, and jams some vital piece of infrastructure. So that is the worst case. Hundreds of people with jammers in their vans or their cars passing infrastructure that is critical. And of course there's jamming of an actual target where someone deliberately jams it. And then there's unintentional jamming where it's entirely non-malicious but just as bad. The effect is just as bad. Far more damaging is spoofing because it's intending to deceive you. But by the time you have 4 constellations, it's incredibly hard to spoof. You have to be able to spoof all of those signals, all 4 constellations, in a compatible way. Todd Walters has demonstrated it very, very well. You can do it on a single constellation. But to do it on 4 constellations simultaneously is very, very difficult. Going to something different, something other than GNSS, the question is when. I've worked for a long time towards having LoRaN as my alternative, not because I personally wanted an alternative. I don't really need an alternative in a car or in a consumer device in a building. I was working on it for the purposes of reading timing off LoRaN, or maybe even a course position off LoRaN, so that I could get GPS started at an extremely low signal level deep in a building. So that's one of the options, is LoRaN, and there are groups in Northern Europe and groups on the east coast of America who are strongly supporting it. even though America as a nation hasn't committed itself yet. The other one is Wi-Fi, but it's never very accurate. I call it localization rather than position, and it's got no nanosecond timing on it. It certainly could have if you designed a new system, but the benefit of Wi-Fi is that it is there. We don't want a new system. We want to be able to use all those little beacons that are already installed. Both of these options also give us an integrity function by giving us a rough position that we can compare with our GNSS position and say, whoops, something's wrong. So they are very, very good as an integrity aid. So back to purchasing decisions. Again, I stress the point, it's a very long cycle. The market, being the person on the street, cannot buy the end product until it's offered to him. And it's not going to offer to him until he has a system in a nice plastic box with a display and buttons. That's not going to happen until somebody makes that nice box. And to do that, they need the chips and the software that goes with the chips in addition to the software they write themselves for their own function. The chip design depends on the ICD. I target that at people who don't release their ICD on time. And it happens again and again in different countries. I'm not targeting any particular one today. The chip production depends on a very, very high volume market. So the market has already to have been developed before you can make a chip. So it's a vicious circle, sometimes called catch-22. We go back to point one. The market can't buy it until it's available, but the chips aren't going to get made until the market wants to buy it. In addition to that, we need to have a signal from somewhere for testing purposes. GPS was wonderful in that point because before we started making chips, the signal had been there for 10 or 15 years, which was extremely good. And then the second thing we need is a significant constellation. One satellite's enough for testing the signal, but we need a significant constellation of satellites before we can test for real. More cycles, as in design cycles. I'm going to compare two opposites here. In the phone, the design cycle is so fast that chips have difficulty intersecting. That is, if you have any chips at all, because very often the GNSS function is buried in a big chip that's multifunction. So the other end of the spectrum is in a car where it's so slow, between 4 and 8 years to get to volume from first thinking about it, that the chip's obsolete before the car manufacturer gets it. So it makes life very, very difficult. And that's one of the advantages of what I call these quasi-legislative steps that will make the markets build quickly. So finally, what do we need? Well, to get to Alan's promised land, we need a major rollout of multi-frequency receivers. We're all ready to do it, but we haven't got a market that justifies us making the chips. So you can look through my conference papers for the last 2 or 3 years, and you see I've been trying to, shall we say, put paving stones, a path to get to this, but I'm still straining. Then we also need something like ELORAN rolling out, or kill it so that we can go and chase other things. So the multi-frequency would get more emphasis if ELORAN totally died. But I prefer ELORAN to really roll out and get President Obama to say, America's going to do it, because without America, the rest of the world is just not going to go. For redundancy purposes, we'd say do both. Get multi-frequency and get ELORAN. Thank you very much. Back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Philip. Regarding your remarks about ELORAN, we have upcoming, I'm preparing right now an article for the July issue of the magazine on ELORAN, or actually a new iteration of ELORAN, ED-LORAN, and that will be the cover story of the July issue of GPS World. We go now to John Pottle of Spirent Positioning Technology. John is a fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation, and at Spirent, he not only deals with simulation of GNSS signals, but simultaneously signals telecommunications and critical infrastructure. So we're going to hear about several aspects of signal simulation and the future for users from John. John, it's yours.
Thank you, Alan. Hello, everybody. Well, I like this chart from the University of New South Wales, as if you look at it, it includes a huge range of GPS and more recently multi-GNSS applications. Although if you study it carefully, one interesting thing to note is that all the applications you can see here are outdoors. But notwithstanding that, the chart really underlines the fact of how good and how useful GPS and multi-GNSS are, and the range of applications that they've spawned beyond what anybody imagined. In relation to the question asked by this webinar, let me just state my position up front. So the webinar asks whether we should wait until the perfect system becomes available, or whether we should continuously upgrade at each iterative step along the way. And I think perhaps as the very first question that Alan answered indicated, engineers perhaps don't really believe in perfection or perfect systems. I would certainly argue that we should make full use of the technologies we currently possess, and actually that by combining them, we do get fairly close towards some sort of perfection, or if not perfection, at least some way towards target design performance that many applications demand. So if we start with GNSS, or maybe assisted GNSS, one question I want to pose is maybe we're just expecting too much. And I do think, to an extent at least, that the explosion in applications has perhaps caused, in some areas, us to get a little bit ahead of ourselves. We've become perhaps a bit blind to some of the vulnerabilities and some of the inherent weaknesses that there are in GNSS, which have already been touched on by some of the previous speakers. I mean, as a practical example, last month I was in Hong Kong, and I was experiencing many of the things that are shown on this chart here. And quite honestly, my smartphone, which by the way was quite a new one, was really not usable in the deep urban environment on Hong Kong Island because of a combination of high multipath, few satellites in view, poor geometry, and so on. And as Philip alluded, there have been some incredible advances in recent years. Another personal example is that I've got two in-vehicle navigation systems. One of them's 10 years younger than the other, and the improvement over those 10 years is very noticeable, particularly in these deep urban and GNSS environments. And one of them, the more recent one, even works inside the house, and the other one clearly does not. Man-made threats are potentially much more drastic in their impact on performance. There was a very interesting paper at the recent European Navigation Conference in Rotterdam by Professor Dr. Erik Stunsen, and I apologize if I pronounced his name wrong, from the Dutch Defense Agency. And he presented an analysis of how IT cyber attacks compared to what we're currently beginning to see in GNSS. And he tried to draw some parallels from his research between the pattern of increasing threats in the IT domain with the pattern of increasing threats that we are beginning to see in GNSS. And he advanced the theory that we are seeing a similar escalation, yet to a more compressed timeline than was seen in the IT world. So if we go right back, I think that ignorance and underestimation probably was a feature of the early days of IT attacks. And perhaps the same is true of what we're seeing today in the GNSS world. Philip mentioned the truck driver with his personal protection device, and surely they've got, in general, really not much idea of the wider risks that they may be interfering with others' navigation systems. And as shown on this chart here, when installing a GNSS antenna, to what extent does the planning or installation team really understand the impact of a poor installation? One big challenge that we see all the time in Spirent is that these threats and difficulties and the impact of them is very difficult to assess and very difficult to quantify. So if GNSS is inherently vulnerable, and I think that's fairly clear, and that the current technology that we have today is not quite the perfect system, at least not just GNSS alone, what is the answer? Well, I would argue the first stage lies with the receivers themselves, and that we've seen big performance increases over recent years, but I think there'll be increased sophistication over coming years, partly in terms of multi-GNSS and taking advantage of what you can see here, which is more than a doubling of signals over the next 9 years. Partly with multi-frequency. So this particular chart, and I apologize, it's very busy, but it shows on the horizontal lines the different GNSS systems, GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, Beidou, QZSS, and so on. And from left to right, the different frequencies. You can clearly see there are a huge variety of signals and systems for people to choose from. And as Philip said, adding multi-frequency GNSS offers inherently enhanced protection against jamming, as well as potentially improved accuracy through being able to measure the uncertainty associated with the atmospheric conditions. And then, of course, there's the receiver level approaches to resistance to interference, integrity checking, and resistance to jamming. So we've talked about multi-constellation, multi-frequency architectures. Other approaches include notch filtering, excision techniques, digital signal processing, and there are even antenna-based techniques, such as the use of adaptive antenna technologies to steer a null towards an incident jammer. So just returning to the question for this webinar, the 4 technologies or approaches mentioned here are all being used today, either individually and or in combination, to very good effect, in combination with GNSS, that is. The best approach or combination of approaches really varies very widely, depending on the priorities of the application. For integrity, a ground-based augmentation system, top left here I've shown last, but it could also be one of many other approaches, is usually required. Top right, alternative positioning technologies such as cell ID or Wi-Fi, or Paul, the next speaker, is going to talk about locator, I think, another example. These are indicated where there's a need for continuity in GNSS environment, or GNSS-denied environment. And at the bottom of this chart, many people are combining GPS with IMUs or dead reckoning. And the combination of GNSS, which is a generally high accuracy but not perfect availability, not full availability system, with high availability but open loop systems such as dead reckoning or IMUs, can represent a very good solution. So in summary, I just want to leave a few thoughts about some of the challenges that I see or we see in Spirent. One is that, from what I've said, I think it's clear that I think existing technologies used in the appropriate combinations and iterated as improvements are made is really the way to go. Beyond that, we are beginning to see huge and exciting possibilities for new or extended applications being linked to a growing realization about threats and vulnerability. So on the one hand, you've got more applications. On the other hand, there's certainly more and more talk about threats, vulnerability, whether intentional or unintentional. So one thing that I'd like to suggest is that there's no accepted approach that I'm aware of, at least, for what you might call a class of robustness in receivers. And such a class of robustness, maybe that could include the most important priorities for a particular application. And as a simple example, a system with integrity as the priority would have a very different class of robustness to a system with accuracy as the priority. And I would suggest a very different technical solution to delivering those systems. So in our head, in the PNT community, I think we've got a lot of these ideas and concepts, but as far as I know, they're not really defined anywhere in writing. And linked to that, it's rather unclear to me, at least, how the PNT community should even begin to start talking about these aspects. We're quite unique in that there are very few standards in the PNT community and in GNSS. Very few standards for receiver testing. No generally accepted principles for example, receiver integrity checking. Many proprietary approaches. And I think over the coming years, that's going to be a trend that we're going to see some changes on, and I, for one, would very much welcome that. So thank you for listening, and Alan, I'm handing back to you.
Alan, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you, John. Your presentation sparked a couple of thoughts that I'll set loose just before I turn it over to Paul, and that is that each positioning technology has strengths but also gaps. And even combining two technologies, there's still going to be a gap. And you bring in a third, there's still going to be a gap. And everything has pluses and minuses. A point in that light, I'm going to introduce Paul Benshu from Locata. Locata has a positioning technology that provides accurate PNT in user-defined regions. So if you want all these benefits of the promised land, so to speak, and if you operate an open pit mine, then the promised land is here for you today. However, you can't take your cell phone to Europe or even around town and benefit from Locata technology because you have to set up the user-defined region. Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you now to tell us about Locata and alternative PNT in general. Here you go.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to thank you, Alan, and GPS World for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Like the other speakers, I've been asked to address the question of purchase decisions regarding available PNT equipment in an environment where technology is constantly evolving, especially in the realm of combined solutions. And as Alan said, perhaps I can offer a perspective from a non-GPS point of view, since the company I represent really developed its product line in response to the same questions we're asking today. So the main question that Alan has posed is, when will reliable, robust, consistent, and continuous positioning, navigation, and timing become a reality? And what should we do in the meantime? Should we wait until the perfect system is available, or should we continuously upgrade? Well, in asking these questions, the underlying assumption is that reliable, robust, consistent, and continuous PNT is not yet a reality. And as the previous speakers have insinuated, this assumption may or may not be true, depending on your requirements. In other words, if your requirements are being met with the equipment you already own, then you've already reached your promised land. And there are plenty of users out there who are completely satisfied with what they have. true, they may not be able to accurately position in every environment imaginable, but they don't care because they have no need for those additional capabilities. And if this scenario describes you, then congratulations, you have what you need. However, as many of the rest of us have discovered, accuracy is addictive. We've had a taste of it from our current equipment, and we want more. We want higher accuracy, and we want it more often. And if someone else is getting better PNT than us, it can stimulate a PNT envy, for lack of a better term, that drives us to enhance our own PNT capabilities. Now, in all fairness, PNT envy isn't the only thing that drives us to better capabilities. Many of us have legitimate PNT needs that are not being met with our current solution sets. Often these needs can only be met by combining 2 or more different PNT sensors that can leverage the strengths of each system and compensate for their relative weaknesses to deliver a combined solution that's better than either sensor operated separately. So what are available PNT sensors? Obviously, there's GNSS, which currently includes GPS and GLONASS, with Galileo and Beidou expected to emerge soon. And also I'll throw in the GNSS augmentation systems in this group, since they really can't provide PNT separate from the satellite nav systems they support. For instance, if something were to happen to GPS such that it was not available, it would really do no good to receive a differential GPS signal. Another sensor group would be terrestrial systems, such as LORAN, which is currently being fielded in some parts of the world, as well as something like Locata, that I'd be remiss not to mention since I work for that company. What makes this sensor group interesting is that they're not dependent on GNSS function, which means they have different failure modes and also offer capabilities not offered by GNSS. We'll get into some of those differences in a minute. Another sensor group is what we'll call signals of opportunity. This group is also terrestrial-based, but they're comprised of signals that are not specifically designed for position or navigation. Can be used for this to some degree, and there's been a lot of R&D in this area to exploit those signals for PNT. Then there's inertial sensors that John brought up in his presentation. They don't rely on any radio positioning technology whatsoever, and they've been demonstrated to complement other PNT sensors to provide a more robust solution, so we'll consider those as well. We also need to consider clocks for 2 reasons. One, there's actually a growing user base who use PNT systems and these clocks specifically for accurate time and frequency. And 2, accurate time is essential for most radio positioning systems to work, so leveraging this capability into a combined solution could actually offer a more resilient or robust solution. And finally, there are other sensors that don't necessarily fall into the other group that could help improve our PNT to some extent, so we'll address those as well. Okay, so each sensor group has basic capabilities and limitations. When you start peeling back the onion on this, the list can get pretty substantial, so we won't be able to cover everything here. However, there are some pretty significant ones that we can address. GNSS, which is usually regarded as a first-choice system because of its overwhelming popularity with PNT users, is nearly global and reasonably accurate. And of course, that accuracy will vary according to satellite geometry as well as the employment of augmentation systems. Now, I say that GNSS is nearly global because there are areas where GNSS does not work well. It generally doesn't perform well indoors where signals aren't really available, or perhaps deep canyons where signal availability and sufficient geometry are difficult to achieve, or sometimes in urban environments where multipath might degrade the accuracy, and so on and so forth. Also, because the signals are broadcast at extremely low power level, they're vulnerable to interference, whether it's intentional or not, as some of the other speakers have already mentioned. On the other hand, terrestrial systems tend to be somewhat local. Even LORAN right now is really local at this point because there aren't enough operational ground systems to support a global capability. But we will acknowledge that terrestrial systems can be expanded for increased service areas. In the meantime, the accuracies achieved within the existing network vary according to user base. For instance, if an ELRN network is optimized to support harbor navigation, land users might find the accuracy somewhat diminished. Now, the good news is that terrestrial systems generally deliver much longer signals to GNSS, which makes them less vulnerable to interference and offers PNT in places where GNSS signals simply can't reach. Anyway, we can build this list for the other sensors as well. I'm not going to get into all of the specifics in the interest of time because capabilities and limitations are fairly self-explanatory. However, I'd like to point out that in the other sensor category, which might include technologies such as altimeters and magnetometers, these types of solutions generally don't deliver a complete position or nav solution. Instead, they tend to be best used as supporting aids to other sensors. For instance, an altimeter generally will not give you a position, it will give you your elevation, which could be used to compensate for another nav sensor that might have a weak vertical component. So with this information, you can start to populate a table to make some comparisons and considerations for combined solutions. I've kind of broken up the capabilities and limitations according to availability, whether or not a particular sensor or system delivers all three components of PNT, whether or not indoor nav is possible, signal vulnerability, and whether or not geometry of received signal is important. Of course, depending on your requirements, the table might have different attributes. The goal here really is to analyze the best combined solutions that will meet your requirements. And as you can see, there are a lot of possible combinations and permutations, many of which exist on the market, and some that probably don't. Anyway, let's just take a look at a few of them. The first consideration might simply be a combined GNSS receiver. They certainly exist, as others have pointed out, and there is wisdom in combining different GNSS solutions into a single solution. There's more available signals, and generally if one GNSS fails for whatever reason, the other will not. However, because they're both satellite systems, they both have the same basic limitations. Weak signals don't work well indoors and are subject to interference. Navigating in deep canyons can be an issue due to poor geometry. If these types of conditions are important to you, then a multi-GNSS receiver probably won't get you to the promised land, and you'll need to consider something else. GNSS ELRN receivers are starting to pop up on the market. The pairing of these technologies makes sense because some of ELRN's strengths compensate for GNSS limitations, such as signal strengths and the potential for indoor navigation. However, if your requirements include high precision applications such as surveying or automation, the accuracy might not be sufficient for you, especially if you need to operate in a GNSS-denied environment. So a combined GNSS locator receiver can probably deliver this high precision accuracy, and this solution does exist on the market, as Alan pointed out in his introductory remarks. However, in order to use this capability, you'll first need to install a locator net, ground infrastructure. The covered area will be local, which may be big or small, depending on the locator net that you construct, but it's not global, and if you need a near global capability, you'll need to consider something else. How about GNSS paired with signals of opportunity? Now, most of our cell phones already have this capability, triangulating from cell tower signals to help with nav applications. Sometimes it works well, sometimes not. You'll have to decide if this meets your requirements. And how about GNSS and inertial solutions? This is a tried and true pairing of technologies and works quite well, as long as one does not need to survive without the other for too long. Inertial sensors tend to drift, and sometimes quite rapidly, without frequent updates from GNSS. If your requirements include operating in a prolonged GNSS-denied environment, then this solution set might not meet your needs. So how about GNSS coupled with some type of an atomic clock? This solution is available, and it's currently employed in some precision time applications. But it's generally not a mobile solution due to the complexity of the clock. Now, there has been a lot of work on improving chip-scale atomic clocks, and if they can live up to their promises, this could be quite interesting. But chip-scale atomic clocks are not readily available. And finally, let's just look at this combination quickly. Multi-GNSS, inertial, altimeter, and magnetometer. This solution actually does exist. And the combination of these sensors makes sense. I haven't tried it myself, so I can't comment on its actual performance, and I have no idea what it costs. But depending on your requirements, it might be a possibility. And it's a good demonstration of how combining different sensor technologies with different stabilities and failure modes can be combined to give some potentially interesting results. So in conclusion, what are we saying? The PNT promised land is heavily dependent on your particular requirements, and there may be a current solution that will get you there now. But on the other hand, PNT technology continues to evolve, and combined solution sets continue to emerge. So in my opinion, there's really no such thing as the perfect system. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to wait for that perfect system. There's always something better around the corner. And many of the existing combined solutions are probably better than standalone solutions. So if it's important to you, an interim solution might get you closer to the promised land, even if it doesn't take you all the way there. And with that, back to you, Alan.
All right, thank you, Paul. We have time for a couple of questions. We're going to run a little bit over the top of the hour, not too far. I do want to ask our panel speakers at least two questions. And before I do, I'm just going to put up the link so that all of you out there can download these slides to the webinar. You can do that right away. Also, the webinar itself will be fully downloadable both as an audio file and with the slides in about a week's time. I'll look on our website for that. The first question for our panel comes from one listener who writes in and asks, how long before companies start offering L1, L5 algorithms? Now that strikes me as a high precision type of question. So Steve Alt, I'm going to put that question over on your table first, if you have any comment on that.
Certainly. For the most part, most of the high precision GNSS receiver manufacturers are waiting for a full enough constellation in order to offer such a receiver. And even in the receivers, many of the receivers that are on the market today, including ours, they're L5 capable. The nav algorithms exist. It's just a matter of having enough functional satellites to allow L1, L5 to stand on their own as opposed to L1, L2, and L5.
Thanks, Steve. Does anybody else want to take a run at that question?
Well, I guess the only other point of detail I can offer, this is John speaking, is that I think I'm right in saying there are 6 GPS 2F satellites in orbit today, and it's only from the 2F series that the L5 signal on GPS came in. So, as Steve said, it will be a very long time indeed before we get a full constellation or a adequate constellation of L5 satellites.
As I recall, the current plan is for that constellation to be completed somewhere around 2021. So, we still have a good number of years for them to get to the point where we can use it standalone.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Another question came in. do we really have two very different promised lands, one outdoor and one indoor? Philip, why don't you take that first, and then John, you might want to chime in again.
I would agree very strongly. Outdoor, as in a field or on the open sea, I'd say we have our promised land already. But indoors, it's a far-off dream, shall we say, rather than a true promised land, because in deep indoors, really nothing is working at the moment. And the only thing that's reasonable, without installing new infrastructure, obviously we can put our locator beacons everywhere we like, but they're not there. Without installing new infrastructure, indoor in the occupied world, that is, I mean not in caves, if we have count that as indoor, where it's a Western world with or a civilized world with power available. Where power's available, there are generally Wi-Fi beacons, and we can generally tell where we are to the nearest beacon. But that's all. It's really not good. We've always said for probably 10 years that in serious buildings, that's those with concrete and steel, in serious buildings, the accuracy of a GNSS signal, even if you make a receiver sensitive enough, which we can do, the accuracy is only as good as remembering where you were when you came in through the front door. You don't improve after you've gone in. So if there are a lot of Wi-Fi beacons around a big building, great. But for smartphones, it's wonderful because they already have the receivers. It's only a matter of putting the right software in the right place. But for general purpose use, no, we've got a very long way to go for indoor operation.
Okay, I'll chime in very quickly. Completely agree. The indoor promised land does feel much more difficult to get to, and the outdoor promised land, particularly if you combine the various technologies we've heard on this webinar, it's possible to pretty much do what you need today. The only other thing I'd add is that indoors, localization is something we're getting somewhat close to. You know, you might be able to have your smartphone on a contactless payment terminal, and if that terminal knows its location, then it can update the position in your smartphone, for example. Or if you've got a beacon in the aisle of a shopping mall, then maybe as you pass it, you can update your local position. But indoor navigation is something that, in my personal view, is a way off in any really promised land type of way.
Thanks, John. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm not going to answer it, though, and I'm not going to have our panel answer it, because there's a very good article in the June issue of GPS World, which has just appeared and which answers this question. One listener wrote in to ask that we show the pros and cons of the synergy of using multiple GNSS measurements. Pitfalls and gains were important, he or she writes. How to handle differing time standards between the measurements, and this is specifically addressed in the June cover story by Frank Van Diggelen from Broadcom. Any studies done for a triple combination? Well, by gosh, they have a triple combination. They have more than a triple combination in their chipset, but what they're showing is the triple combination, GPS plus GLONASS plus regional Beidou. Finally, the question of diminishing returns versus computational effort and software integration, algorithm complexity. Well, they kind of perhaps skate around the edge of that aspect of the question, but it's a very interesting article. I recommend it to you. Cover story, multi-GNSS interoperability done by Frank Van Diggelen, June issue. I'd like to thank our panel, Steve Alt, Philip Matos, John Pottle, and Paul Benschoof. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Navcom, of the Market Insights webinar series. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for joining us. And again, if you found this webinar of interest, it will be available for download. You can tell your friends and colleagues about it. Just check the website in another week or so. And with that, thank you, and goodbye from all of us, and over to you, Bethany.
As Alan said, thank you for attending today's webinar. An on-demand recording will be emailed to you within 2 weeks, and it will be available at gpsworld.com/webinars. While you're there on our site, you should be sure to catch the on-demand version of our last webinar, GNSS Interference Detection and Mitigation for UAV Navigation, which just became available on demand. Our next scheduled webinar, The Hottest Mapping Trends, is a big one for us here at GPS World. It will be coming to you live from the show floor at the Esri International User Conference in San Diego on Thursday, July 17th at 10 a.m. Pacific or 1 p.m. Eastern. Alan Cameron will again be moderating for us with keynote speaker and industry expert Eric Gackstetter and speakers pulled right off the show floor. Again, you can register for these or view them, view past events of these online now at gpsworld.com/webinars. We look forward to seeing you there.